Namaste Friends, welcome back to the video learning series for web technology. In last few lessons we have been going through various aspects of JavaScript, more specifically the language aspects of JavaScript, the basic variables and literals and arithmetic operators and different operators, the looping constructs, the conditional statements, functions, and special functions for strings and so on and so forth. At this point, we have covered most of the basic necessities for a language such as JavaScript. But the main purpose of JavaScript, we have been told in the beginning, is that it gives dynamism and interactivity to HTML. We have not really studied that aspect of it. Maybe we did study few special functions that are there in JavaScript that allows you to prompt some messages to the user, but really we have not really hooked up HTML and JavaScript so far. We have been studying JavaScript as an independent language, but today we will try to take a look at how to hook up the JavaScript that we have developed to a HTML web page. This thing is essentially called embedding JavaScript. This term embedding JavaScript refers to the process of the created JavaScript. How do we link it to a HTML document? There are two ways of doing it. If you remember the CSS lesson, there were 4 ways of linking the defined styles to HTML. In JavaScript, though, there are only two ways of doing it. One is the external JavaScript, the other is the embedded JavaScript. I am just reading out in the reverse order. The embedded JavaScript and the external JavaScript, these two are the ways in which we can link our defined JavaScript code to a HTML document. What is embedded JavaScript? Let's look at the example on the right hand side. We'll go through them one by one. Embedded JavaScript uses the script tag of HTML and places all the JavaScript, all of the code that we have written over there. Now let's look at the right hand side. It's a complete HTML file given for illustration purposes. What JavaScript file code that we wrote? We wrote one function called my function. Okay, it will try to do some slicing operation on a string and then update the document with the result slice. Okay, line number 6 to line number 16 is the JavaScript code that we have written. However, where did we place this? We put it as the content of the script tag, which is beginning in line number 5 and ending in line number 17. Now this script tag can be placed anywhere in HTML, whether it is in the body or whether it is in head, it doesn't really matter. Okay, and then the linking part is if this is including the JavaScript part, the linking, meaning telling it when to use this JavaScript function, is briefly touched upon in line number 3. There is a button that is placed there called try it, and there is an on click is equal to my function, right? What it really means is when that button is clicked, call the JavaScript function my function. This is how we are linking. First, we have included the JavaScript in the same HTML file, and then we are also asking that when that button in line number 3 is clicked upon by the user, the my function JavaScript function must be invoked. So this is how we are linking these two together. Individual HTML elements refer to JavaScript functions, just like how we did it in line number 3. Now the problem with this is we are never dealing with a single HTML page. Each website will have hundreds of pages. We really want all the JavaScript to be same. However, in this mechanism, we are duplicating the same JavaScript file code in every HTML page. The second way of doing the JavaScript linking is through something called external JavaScript. What is an external JavaScript? If you look at the example on the right hand side, it is a lot more clear. However, we'll go through the description. External JavaScript uses the script tag of the HTML the same way as before, the same tag as before. However, instead of the JavaScript being the content of the script tag, we are not using the content part. We are using the type and src attributes of the script tag to refer to an external JavaScript file. What does this mean? Number one, we have taken out all the JavaScript that we have written, placed it in a new file and kept it separately. Let's call that as learn.js. Okay, so now this file is separately available. It is not part of the HTML. The second part that we did is we used two attributes of the script tag, type and src. The src is attribute has the value of the file name of our JavaScript, learn.js, and the type attribute has the value of text/JavaScript. This is essentially telling the browser that there is a script which is a text file, but it has JavaScript inside, and the file name is learn.js, and more importantly that this JavaScript should be loaded when the page is loaded in the browser. That is what it tells the browser. The second part of using the JavaScript from within the HTML file is the same. You can see line number 3 on the screen on the top right hand side has not changed between the embedded JavaScript versus external JavaScript. It's the same. So we continue to use it the same way. Now the advantage here is all the HTML pages in the website, they can continue to refer to the same JavaScript file. So there is no duplication of the JavaScript code in anywhere. The JavaScript code is all in only one place, and any bug fixes that we make or any enhancements that we make is all localized to that. So that is very advantageous as far as the development is concerned and maintenance. Not to mention, each HTML file can have multiple JavaScripts linked in the way that we have demonstrated here. Line number 5 and 6, for example, can be repeated for multiple different JavaScript files. You should also be aware that the value for the src attribute need not be just the file name. Technically speaking, it is the URL of the JavaScript file. It can be a local link or it can be an external link, maybe coming from a completely different server. So you should, if you are confused with these two references, then you should go back and listen to the links lesson of the HTML where we talked about relative links and absolute links. The expectation for the src is that whatever value is there put as the src is essentially a URL, whether it is relative or absolute, to get the JavaScript file. In our examples, we use relative addressing or relative links, but it need not be. Many times we refer to some third-party JavaScript libraries that are actually not on the same server as where our HTML pages reside on. This is the external JavaScript. I hope you understood the two references. Now let's look at the example of the same example actually, but how we are modifying the HTML from the JavaScript. We have not touched upon it. I am talking really about line number 15. Okay. In the example on the left hand side, the browser, because we put a button there in line number 3, shows a try it button. Okay. However, when that button is clicked, see what we are doing. In line number 15, we are querying the any HTML element with the ID demo. Now, you must be familiar that all HTML elements must have an ID, and if it is optional in that sense, but if you want to query from JavaScript or so, it must have an ID, and we are querying for that element which has the ID demo. Look at the HTML, line number 4, we can see it is actually a paragraph with the p tag that has the ID demo, but it doesn't really have any content, it's an empty paragraph. However, what we are doing in line number 15 is we are querying for that element. At this point, we have the tag and we are changing the content of it by setting the inner HTML property to the string coming out of line number 13, which is really the slicing of the original string. So S2 will have Rama killed as a string, and that string we are putting it as a content for the empty paragraph, which is the paragraph with the ID demo. So end of line number 15, the paragraph identified by the ID demo is no longer empty, it rather has the string Rama killed as the content. This is an example of modifying the HTML from within JavaScript. There is no restriction that you only modify the HTML. You can keep the HTML, modify parts of it, use the regular expressions, change parts of it. You can actually keep the HTML as is, but change the style to make the paragraph go from a paragraph to something else, or come up with a different CSS for it. All these are possible to be done from JavaScript using the DOM API. The line number 15 is an example of using the DOM API that we talked about in the very first class for modifying the HTML using DOM API by JavaScript. The other direction, we want to call JavaScript from HTML, right? This is also there in the previous case where we said on click do something, but take the example on the screen on the left hand side. We have a JavaScript function between line number 6 and line number 18, and this function is called book vaccination. Okay, this is essentially doing a prompt to get some vaccination center and so on. This we have covered in one of our earlier lessons, so we'll not dwell too much into that aspect. However, see how this function is linked to the HTML in line number 3. I am creating a button called book vaccination. However, I am saying when this button is clicked, call the JavaScript function called book vaccination with a parameter of 24. So the on-click attribute has a value book vaccination in brackets 24, in parenthesis 24. What it means is when that button is clicked, that particular JavaScript function is called. Therefore, immediately our JavaScript function gets in and then it will do a prompt. You can see the example on the right hand side. On the top, you have this simple HTML page with just the button, and then what happens if you click that button? It immediately shows the prompt dialog. Here is an example of us linking something in HTML to a JavaScript function. This linking is essentially based on something called event. What is an event? Event is anything that is resulting mostly from a user interaction. For example, user clicks on a button, user submits a form, user loads a page, user resets a form, user does something, user puts cursor in a text field, user goes out of the text field, These are all different events. User double clicks on a particular element in page. These are all various events that are essentially resulting out of a user action. We can use these events and link them to our preferred JavaScript functions. An example of somebody linking a JavaScript function to a click event is there on line number 3. When the event is click, the attribute name becomes onClick. So we have to put a value to that attribute, and that value should be the JavaScript function invocation. It can be some inline JavaScript there as well, but that's too complicated. We would not prefer it that way. We would rather simply call a JavaScript function that will do the job for us. Now that we understood the events, what are different kind of events that we have support for in JavaScript? Here are some common events in HTML that you can use to link an event to a corresponding JavaScript function. Note that these are technically called DOM events, and their list is actually much more bigger than what is there. These are some popular and commonly used events in HTML. On change, it means a HTML element has changed. It can be text box, it can be anything. On click, user clicks on a HTML element. On DBL click, this is really double click. On mouse over, on mouse out. On key down, on load. We don't really need to go through each of the items here. These are common events. But remember, the actual event is without the on part of the string. The attribute name is with the on. So onClick is the attribute, and it has to have a corresponding JavaScript function invoked from within the HTML code. That's it in this class. In this class, we have learned how we can link our JavaScript code to HTML, and more importantly, how to once we link it, how do we change HTML from JavaScript, and how to call JavaScript from within HTML. And we lastly we looked at different events that are possible in JavaScript, some of the most popular ones. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Until the next lesson, that's it for now. Thank you.